Recording.
Okay.
And we're recording. Hi, Carlina.
Hi.
Thank you so much for doing this with me, this National Poetry Month Chit Chat series from our living room, I guess. I'm so excited to have you here. We were fellows as part of the Radical Poetry program last year, and you were so bright and luminous. And then I read your work, and your work is exceptional. And I was just so grateful to be in a space with you and just everybody else who was in that program, because they were so innovative with the way they were working with poetry, that it was such, to me, it really changed the way I think those 3 days. So I'm excited that I can talk to you again. So for the people who are watching this, I'm going to read your bio. Carlina Duan is a writer educator from Michigan, the author of the poetry collection I Wore My Blackest Hair from Little A 2017. She currently teaches at the University of Michigan, where she's also a PhD student in the Joint Program of English and Education. In 2019, she received her MFA in poetry from Vanderbilt University, where she served as the co-editor-in-chief of Nashville Review. Carlina directs a short story workshop for young writers at Neutral Zone, a youth center for creative arts in Ann Arbor. Her second book of poems, Alien Miss, is forthcoming from the University of Wisconsin Press in the spring of 2021. Carlina Duan is a writer-educator from Michigan. Oh, no, that's it. The spring of 2021. Sorry, that got posted twice. But Alien Miss is such a great title for a collection. It's so... God, you know, and was it Jenny Zhai's Eye Level?
Yeah.
And I think of oh my God, what a name. I feel like
Alien cover. Yeah, totally.
As a cover. I can imagine how fantastic a cover of a book called Alien Miss would be. So I hope you get the crew together for that. But yeah, I will let you take it away and read us.
Yeah, sounds great. And thank you so much for having me. I love this so much, and it's just such an honor to share digital space with you and talk about poems.
It's an honor. I was like,
yes, totally. Can you see my screen if I do this?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm gonna read this poem, which is about my grandfather, my Wài Gōng. And I wrote this poem about a little under a year ago, last spring, so actually maybe a year ago. It's called Wài Gōng is Dancing. Wài Gōng is dancing in a wool cap, in the bathtub, on market streets and in the fat doorway of his first home, where jars overflow with melon candies and a bicycle with a broken bell sags against the window. He's dancing in the soccer field, the sweet potato cellar, the narrow hallway of the nation's 75th public school. Outside, a flagpole, a lone seagull. The bell rings and boys billow past. My Wài Gōng toe taps, does a grapevine jig, calls for their attention, but the boys see past him, his swollen body, his parched mouth. So he's dancing into our homes now, watching one of us braid Abby's hair to dark twists and turns. Da Yi lights the stovetop, mutters a few words as the match sparks, then soots to black in her palm. And there's Wài Gōng again, levitating against the pot of green peppers and tapping his heels together, making that strange clanging sound, vying for us to see. The fish in the tank gurgle, the milk sucked through a straw. When's the baby due? The distant cousin asks my cousin, and her mouth opens into a slow moon, letting the breath fall out. Leaving the house then, Wài Gōng sways into the yellow sea, tucking his arms behind his back, vein-striped legs punching the brine. He's chortling. The vendors hawk cheap souvenirs, fake pearls coiled into rings, dried squid packaged into plastic sacks. The ocean dips and folds him up, giddy, delicious, and Wài Gōng laughs and laughs and laughs and laughs, a laugh of fake teeth, soaked each night for decades in clear sanitizing solution. Last night, he died. We all leaked a little light, watching him go, his granddaughters and daughters, only a few of us by his side, the rest scattered across the water, nestled into new tucks of land. He lifts himself up. Ocean, peach, Sunlight approaching grave, water, grandfather dancing, eating oranges will eventually leave for him at his tomb. Joss sticks will roast till the red paper money smokes his way rich. Wrapped in a flag, he dances. Somewhere out there, he presses the boombox, silver buttons primed to play, pray. So much to feast on in a life. The intimacy of breath, the rippling kindness of white dough, the forward slope of the living. Past it all, Wài Gōng slow dances. The waves fill with salt, then spray.
Oh my God. Oh my, what an exceptional piece. I found myself like choking up through it, especially because it just didn't feel like a portrait of your grandfather who loves to dance, but also what his dancing can shift and change and morph a family into a kind of unit, right? And I really love how that one, like what happens when like the male figure of a family or the patriarch of the family is a person who loves to dance, and then how does that make the family, reimagines the family as a different unit,
right?
And it's so, I mean, I love that whatever's happening, as there's food being made, as there is children being born, that the dancing is always alive. So even when he passes away, that dance is still, like, you can hear the tapping of his footsteps, and I love that. I wanted to know, like, where did this poem sort of come from? Like, how did it?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want, should I keep sharing my screen? I'm happy to, or I can X out.
No, I just need to look at one line at the end if you don't.
Yes. Okay. I'll keep it up.
Okay.
So yeah, the origin story of this poem. So last year, my Wài Gōng, so my mother's father, passed away in China, and I found myself actually at that point, I'd been kind of at a strange stuck point where I wasn't writing a lot of poetry. And I actually found myself, like the night that I heard of his passing, just writing this poem, which is a very imaginative poem, because in life, my Wài Gōng was a very kind of stoic yet playful figure, very like very gentle and very kind of quiet in some ways, but also very kind of always had a twinkle in his eye in some ways. And I grew up going to visit him once every like 3 or 4 years of my childhood, and then a little bit more frequently into my early adulthood. And so I found myself just writing this poem in some ways as an anthem to his life, but also thinking about the creative lineage that he's left behind in my family. And, you know, he's someone that, as with both of my grandfathers, they have lived like so many lives packed into each of their many decades on Earth. And you know, I'd actually never seen him dance in real life. And so for me, this poem was an attempt to kind of reimagine the afterlife of him in terms of like his legacy living on in my family, but also sort of think through the ways that my family like exists across ocean lines, and then of course in Qingdao, which is the city where my parents are from, and sort of trying to write a lot of that life of the city into existence, and think through also the life where he made for himself and grew up. So that's kind of the origin story of this poem.
You know, I love that, because sometimes that's been such an integral question in my work, whether it's poetry and or fiction, in that when I try to, when some part of my life slips in and some part of my ancestry slips in, I think like, oh, there is a choice I can make. I can call up my parent and I can talk to them about their parents. I can learn about that life. But there's a part of me that's always resistant to do that. I like, sometimes I don't want to know the details, and I'm happy like imagining details. And I'm always thinking, is this fair? Is this not fair? But also, I feel my own exploration in my work is better off for it if I can like imagine, if my imagination of their life paints them as a kinder figure somehow. I don't know. I wonder what you think about that idea of like imagining your parents and your grandparents' stories.
Yeah, I think it reminds me in some ways of Rita Dove has this really amazing interview where she was talking about writing Thomas and Beulah, which is her book about her. It's some ways it's a book about the kind of hearts of both of her grandparents, but it's also reimagined in some ways because neither of her grandparents' names were Thomas nor Beulah. But in this interview, she talks about kind of the difference between fact and essence. And she says that as a poet, she's trying to remain honest to the essence of the people that she's writing about, and that, you know, she's not necessarily capturing, it might not be that like her grandparents wore a yellow sweater that she writes into the poem, but the essence of the yellow sweater is true, and that's what she's trying to focus on. And I think for me, this is a question that I really grapple with in my own work as well, in terms of like, who am I accountable to, and how can I write in a way that feels you know, honest, fair, compassionate, and of course, like just not tokenizing of the communities that I am accountable to and for. And I think a lot about that question of fact and essence. And I think for me too, as a child of immigrants, but as someone who grew up in a completely different country than my parents did, part of me is, I think, slowly kind of reckoning with the fact of, you know, I'm never going to be able to know the actual facts in some ways of their childhood because I didn't live through those facts. So all I know is really stories and also firsthand experience of like encountering the essences of folks that I love. And I think for me, it's really important that I remain true and accountable to that essence, but also, you know, embrace sometimes the fact that, yeah, I don't know the full history or the full fact. And I think that also has a lot to do with like, you know, the responsibility of the writer is, as writers, you have the power of portrayal. And I think for me, especially this past year, I've had a lot of kind of questioning within my own work. And a lot of like writing and rewriting and sort of coming to like unlearn in some ways what it is that I'm really trying to write about and for, and why I'm drawn to writing about family, or why I'm drawn to writing about like Chinese American history, despite the fact that a lot of those histories are ones that, you know, I can't really live as someone who was born here and lives in 2020 now. So yeah, but I love what Rita Dove says about fact and essence, and that's something that kind of buoys me, or something that I think about in that strand of imaginative or reimagined history or work.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine there to be another way, you know. I've been having these conversations with a few people, and it's come up a few times that your version of history may not be the accurate version anyway.
Yeah,
So many times, like we have such rich imagined pasts that
right.
become a part of like the truth telling
Yeah,
version.
yeah.
And you know, the stories you assume or imagine or listen to as children, there is no definitive way to prove any of that. So
Mm-hmm.
I think everything boils down to an essence anyway, even
Yeah,
childhood, right?
yeah,
And I think that I don't imagine, like, especially with poetry, I don't know what true, like, factual, what fact checking does anything to the
right,
actual form. I don't know if it makes it any better or makes it any worse.
right.
But essence, on the other hand, makes it rich and makes it vivid, like this poem is. And I see it feels like the only way to do it.
Yeah, and what you're saying reminds me of the fact too that like essence is so simultaneous in some way. Like I'm thinking about Elizabeth Alexander has this line that I love where she says many things are true at once. And I'm thinking about with fact sometimes there's more of a rigidity and there's more of a like it is this way. It's black or it's white or it's whatever, right or wrong. Essence, I think, allows for more of an expansiveness, which something can be true and factual and also carry a certain kind of essence, a certain kind of spirit that is true and factual. It can also be an imagined essence that is still rooted in like the truth of who someone is or what someone is like or how you experience them to be like.
Mm.
So I'm just thinking about you saying that reminds me that there's so much expansiveness to being a poet and being able to like approach things from so many sides and kind of live with multiple truths, which
Mm.
is so hard. It's like so hard to do that. The older I get, I'm like, how do I do this? But also yeah, it's so like fruitful for me, I think, to try and like listen to multiple truths of something or someone.
Yeah, I agree with like that, especially when we're working with, I guess, students, especially undergraduate or early writers of poetry. I think this is always the concern, that how do you do it? Like, it's so difficult to even boil it down to that. And I find that particularly interesting to explore, both as a writer and as an educator, because I have such a, like, when I'm not writing, I have such a rational, fact obsessed brain. Like,
Mm,
it's like that tussle between the left and right parts of the
mhm.
brain, right? And I'm
Yeah.
very much like, rational and fact oriented. But
Yeah.
then suddenly I realized that when I struggle with the idea that poetry expected this persona of me, or expected this like generosity of me, that I felt was like, I'm not capable of it, like
Mm-hmm.
even doing that. It felt like a performance. So
Mm.
now I am thinking of also essence as like, I mean, I wouldn't call it essence, but just like memories or fragments as like our own versions of the fact, like
Yeah.
our. So for me,
Yeah.
detailing it that way is just a lot easier. That makes my poetry is more narrative anyway, so it feels like it really fits into that idea.
Yeah.
And
Right.
that's what I try to tell my students. And like, I wonder how you, when, because you teach, you're teaching at Michigan and you've taught at several places, and when you enter a class of like baby poets, and you're having them to like, because they, a lot of them are just like, oh, poetry, like,
Yeah.
what, like, oh, what the intellectual, it's too intellectual, it's too elitist academically, it's too. So when
Mm.
you bring into class, like, what is the expectation, or what is the question you're asking them to answer in their work?
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's so true that I think when we have students who have only experienced poetry in certain contexts, or even like certain writers, it can feel like this really rigid door that is like, I'm trying to budge it open, it won't crack open. So I think for me, like what I'm trying to do is, I mean, I think I'm trying to be like, maybe it's not a door, maybe it's like so many windows, and let's like jump through them and like look at all of these, like let's look at light, let's look at like air. And like, I think what the questions for me that are interesting about poetry are those questions of like, how can you how can you be like fully devoted and honest and commit yourself to like writing in a way that just feels like true for you and feels true for maybe your multiple experiences or kind of holographic experiences of maybe one thing. Because I think we're taught, I mean, at least for me, I'll say I was taught in terms of writing from an early age that there was maybe a more prescriptive way of imagining the world. And there was one kind of way, and then there was another kind of way. But that was sort of it. And I think sometimes the students that I have are entering classrooms and they sort of think that they're, quote, bad writers because they've been taught that the way that they think or that they imagine something doesn't meet the expectations of like an assignment sheet or a syllabus. And so one of the things for me that's interesting about teaching poetry is sort of thinking about like almost like a rock that you get and you kind of smash it against the pavement and it opens up and there's all these sort of like crystally things inside. And maybe that's a little bit woo-woo, but I think I'm trying to get students to sort of unlearn in some ways the context that they've ingrained within themselves about writing. Like writing, I think for a lot of students does not equal healing or does not equal like sort of like freedom in some ways. So part of the project of like poetry and like learning alongside students in poetry is like, for me at least, is about unlearning what they've been taught writing is, that there's a, quote, good way or that there's a bad way, and tapping into instead like believing that they are their own fountains of knowledge and that there are other fountains of knowledge in the room around them that are not me, that are like their other, you know, peers and fellow writers. And trying to create like a writing space that feels like generative but really generous, and that they can start trusting themselves, you know, as capable of like creating or imagining something that matters and that is interesting, but then also being able to extend that trust to their peers. And so, yeah, I mean, I love teaching. Right now, I don't teach poetry. I'm teaching like first year writing, which is so interesting and like, and in some ways follows that similar trajectory of like unlearning writing habits from, or maybe unlearning associations with writing from the past. But poetry is like my secret sort of favorite subject to teach. So I miss
It's so interesting because I've only ever taught poetry not as a creative writing major, but as an elective. So you don't have just the English majors in the class. You have all of them who just like, oh, I'm going to do creative writing for whatever reason.
right.
And a lot of them come into class because they probably wrote poems in their diaries when they were in eighth and ninth grade. They're like, oh, if I have to take an elective, this must be fun. And then you're sort of, you want to encourage that part of them. Like, yes,
Yeah.
it's a lot like tapping into that part, which made you want to
Yeah.
write, then look at your phone. But
Yeah.
then also, like, introduce form and introduce a universe.
Right.
And say that
Right.
you're not constrained to this, but like, this is part of like the learning. Like, you have to learn the etymology of the universe and like what is happening over here. It's always such a tricky, you know, thing, and especially when we're reading poems that are a bit experimental or that are very individual to a specific writer. You know, they always ask these questions about like craft, which you can arrive at an answer, but you can also say that I think you would have to read more of this poet's work to understand why they do this way or why their work functions this way. So I actually had a few questions to ask you about this poem.
Yeah.
Gonna...
Let me know if you want me. I can also like scroll or kind of make it maybe fit. It's a lot of.
I mean, there are a couple of things that are happening here at like the crafts level, right? First is the obvious, like everything is in lower case. Even after a period, everything is in lowercase. There are a few colons that show up through the length of this poem. Like right here, I see outside a flagpole, a lone seagull. You know, there's that listing that keeps happening. There was another one down there, like cheap souvenirs, fake pearls coiled into rings, dried squid packaged into plastic sacks, and so on. And then I think about the italics. You know, you have the first one, when's the baby due, which to me read like a dialogue, like the distant cousin asked my cousin. But then I was very much, I guess, when it came back later on, so much to feast on in the life. I was like, who's speaking here? And like, whose voice is this? And whether it's, you know, it felt like the grandfather's voice to me is how I like read it, like heard it when you were reading it. So yeah, I wanted to ask you, like, how did the process of building this, I guess, language for this poem come about?
Yeah. Well, I think so in terms of the kind of observation about capitalization, so I kind of was raised in a literary arts world here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I went to. I was super lucky, and there's a poetry center that I now teach at called the Neutral Zone. Or it's an arts kind of nonprofit for young people, and we had a poetry workshop every Thursday, and I sort of became inaugurated within that poetry workshop as like a 16-year-old in reading like Lucille Clifton and reading like Angel Nafis and poets, even like a lot of New York, you know, Angel's from Ann Arbor, which is amazing, but a lot of kind of contemporary poets, and then also like Gwendolyn Brooks, and we were just kind of reading the greats. And that center was run by this amazing Ann Arbor public high school teacher named Jeff Cass, who would bring in contemporary guest poets, and they would come and lead workshops with us. And we were like, you know, 15 and 16. So I think being raised in that tradition where I was like, wow, poetry is real, poetry is alive. And I started reading a lot of contemporary poets where I was noticing things like form, and I was picking up on like who's like doing interesting work. Like Francine Harris is doing really interesting work where she doesn't capitalize, and it doesn't have kind of conventional capitalization in some of her work either. Lucille Clifton for sure. And I think being in tune to that from like a younger age and experimenting. I did a lot of experimenting of like, I used to like never capitalize my eyes. I used to like, you know, and then I used to capitalize, like conventionally capitalize everything. But a lot of that experimentation gave me room to kind of figure out what felt the most exciting for me as a poet. And I think in all my poems, I actually don't capitalize conventionally, really anything. I capitalize my eyes now, which that's kind of newer as of the past few years. But a part of that is just this interest for me and like playing around with the poem as its own sort of like courts. It's like its own basketball court or something. It's its own space. There's its own rules for poetry. And I'm interested in like power dynamics of language and even the ways in which we might typically assign power to like conventional like capitalization, grammar, all of that. So for me, part of the decision not to capitalize things after periods is in some ways, I think it's in some ways an aesthetic decision that I made out of like attention to power and unlearning power with the ways that we might read a sentence, and also just tapping into the playfulness that I feel exists within a poem that might not necessarily, it might not exist. It still exists, but maybe in a different form, in like an essay. So I'm interested in that. With the actual kind of italics and sort of the other images with the colons that happen in this poem, like I'm definitely a very image-based writer, and this poem especially I think is sort of a catalog of images. It's like never ending. And for me, like when I use things like, the milk sucked through a straw, or even like outside a flagpole, a lone seagull, I think I almost see my work as collage making, or poetry as collage making in some ways. And to me, like creating something like outside with a colon is like a signal for like, here's what's about to unfurl next. Look outside, look out this window, or look at this cup of milk. It's being sucked through a straw, but sort of using images alongside punctuation like colons to sort of signal to readers what's about to happen or about to roll out. And I love that you noticed, so much to feast on in a life. Originally, when I wrote this poem, like I said, I hadn't been writing a lot at that time, but I'd been reading a lot. And I was reading the poem Love After Love by Derek Walcott, which is such a beautiful poem. And there's a moment in that poem where he has a line that inspired, in some ways, this line. So this is sort of a tribute to Derek Walcott and his voice sort of speaking here. But it's a poem about, I'm not going to do it justice by synthesizing it. I'll just say you have to read it. It's so beautiful. But he has this sort of idea about feasting on like love and feasting on a self. And I was thinking about that idea of abundance and feast, and sort of somebody passing, in this case, my grandfather passing away, and looking back at the abundance of a life. And so I think that's where this voice, whoever's speaking here, I think it's probably a combination of like my grandfather, but also Derek Walcott, and also just a retroactive, like looking back at a life kind of voice. And then here, of course, it's dialogue. So so I think this poem feels very much, it was a lot of like collage making of just like, and then there's this image and this image, and I want to write in the city of Qingdao, and I want to write in my family. But I also, of course, the one anchor that happens throughout is my grandfather dancing. So.
Yeah, I love that, the idea of like, I'm definitely stealing that, the idea of like looking at a poem as collage making, but also to think of that as an exercise. Like imagine if you could like create multiple images, and then what poem could you make by pulling those images together?
Right.
And to then find the anchor once you find all the different parts of the puzzle.
Totally.
And I absolutely love that. And I've always said, like, every time this has come up, this idea of like lack of capitalization in poems with my students, I'm always saying, maybe in poetry, we talk about like things have to be in uppercase to indicate the beginning of a new sentence, after a period. But maybe like what comes after a period isn't a new sentence. Maybe it's the same sentence. And like, poetry is such like a song in continuation and a thought in continuation. And really like, think of slime. It's like completely, it's like stretched.
I love that.
But it's the same slime, and it's like, it's almost like the ship of Theseus, like once in a while. It's like, at what levels is this the same thing?
Right.
And I love that we can ask these questions with poetry. That's what makes it so exciting, right? Like we can't always like, with prose, even though there's experimental and very exciting fiction and nonfiction that's being written all the time, like we're not working at such a word level. And to me, that is so exciting about poetry. And I'm so glad that you are there in this universe
I'm
with
glad that you're here. Yes.
with your work, and like I absolutely love your work. It's been such a pleasure to like watch you read today, and also to like really witness your own process with
Yeah.
in this
Thank you so much for having me and just for creating this like kind of community space of thinking and talking through poems, especially right now. I'm so grateful that you're like creating this constellation of like little poetry chit chats.
universe.
And
Yeah.
yeah, I'm so grateful for you.
I'm so glad you came on this little very humble Zoom meeting, but I can't wait to like be in dialogue with you all the time,
Yeah, yeah,
from
likewise.
here on. And
Yeah.
absolutely loved it. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank
I'm gonna
you.
stop recording
I'm gonna
now.
stop sharing my screen. Cool.